When any home is built, there is no way to tell how it will echo through years of history. Those who live within become caretakers of a property over the ages and no doubt want to fill it with lots of love and happy memories. So how does a home go from something of love and splendor to being regarded as the most haunted home in an entire country? Could it be that the vengeful spirit of a nun that once lived on the property haunts its halls? Or is it something far more sinister? So keep listening, because this story is coming up. Hello everyone, and I'd like to welcome you back to the Insidious Agenda podcast. As always, I'm your host Nick, and on today's episode, we're going to explore the history of the haunted home known as the Borley Rectory, a home once built to house the family of the local parish priest that, over the years, became one of the most haunted places in all of England. Ensure you're subscribed to our podcast so you don't miss any of our weekly episodes. Now it's time to turn out the lights. Close your eyes. Let things go quiet for a moment. Maybe you're alone, but maybe you're not. Now follow the sound of my voice as we travel to England and open the doors of the Borley Rectory once again. Our story begins in England, in the county of Essex, where we find the small, rural parish of Borley. The town of Borley sits near the border of Suffolk, on the River Stour. Within this parish, once stood a building known simply as the Borley Rectory, a home once built to house the rector, a clergyman largely responsible for the ecclesiastical administration of the parish, and his family. The home was built in 1862, and the Borley Rectory was a mansion built in Gothic Victorian style. It was built on the site of an old monastery that burned down only 21 years before its building, along a site known as the Nun's Walk. As legend has it, in the year 1362, 500 years before the rectory was constructed, there was a nun who worked at the nearby nunnery of Burris. She had fallen deeply in love with a monk from the Borley monastery. She used to walk every evening from the nunnery to the monastery to secretly meet with her lover. They wanted to elope and run away together, but eventually their affair was discovered. On the night they were to be wed, they were caught and brought in for punishment. The only suiting punishment for this transgression was that the monk be put to death. Now, that sounds incredibly harsh, but the nun did not get off as easy. For her punishment, she was to be bricked up alive inside the walls of the convent. As those punishments were carried out, sadly, that is where the lover's story would end. The first inhabitants of the rectory were the family of Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull. Reverend Bull and his wife and their family of 14 children moved into the rectory about a year after it was built. The rectory was built on Hall Road, near the Borley Church. The home was built on the site of a former rectory that had burnt down in 1841. With its original construction, an addition had to be put onto the home to accommodate Reverend Bull's rather large family. Even before the Bull family took up residence, there had been sightings on the grounds where the rectory was built as early as 1819. Reports of a nun that moved about the grounds began to be heard of. It didn't take the Bull family long before they began experiencing paranormal phenomena for themselves. From locals that visited the home, they could hear footsteps move about the house that belonged to no earthly figure. The sound of rushing water could be heard throughout the home, although, after examining the system, it was determined that it was not where those sounds had originated. The tolling of bells could be heard as well, even after all the wires to them were cut. Sounds of crashing and banging were heard that seemed to be centered around the room where one of the Bull's youngest daughters, Ethel, was staying. With the symptoms of the early phenomena, it could have been believed that this entity was a poltergeist. Ethel became an early target for the entity that stalked the halls of the rectory. The entity would rap and bang on her door at all hours of the day and night. Her face was struck by the spirit while in her bed when she slept. In 1886, the spirit was successful in driving the Bull's nursemaid, Elizabeth Byford, from the home. This only occurred after Miss Byford had made light of the haunted room to which she was assigned when she arrived. Miss Byford had only been employed at the rectory for 2 weeks before she departed the home due to the shuffling of footsteps outside her door at midnight. Even with all of these happenings, the Bull family would not be driven from the home. In 1892, Reverend Bull would pass away. His son, Harry Foister Bull, who was actually named Henry after his father, would take up the duties and responsibilities of the rectorship. Over the next few decades, the paranormal phenomena continued to plague the home. One day, while spending some time in the garden with his dog, Juvenile, the dog started barking and howling at a cluster of trees. Harry noticed that a pair of legs was behind the group of trees near the garden. He was puzzled as to whom they belonged. When the legs moved out from behind the group of trees, Harry was astonished to see the body to which they were attached was headless. He watched the spirit cross the garden and pass through a locked gate before he lost sight of it. On several occasions, Harry would also witness a ghostly carriage travel around the property, driven by 2 horses and a carriage driver, who was also headless. The interesting phenomena that came with the carriage, as was noted by Harry, was that when the carriage was seen, it was never heard, absolutely silent. However, when the carriage was heard, it would never be seen. Bull would cross paths with this phantom carriage when traveling a road near their home. He heard the sound of footprints and wheels. When he moved his off to let the carriage pass, he felt it rush by him, but saw nothing. He heard the sounds trail off into the distance, eventually disappearing. It is believed that this might have once been the carriage that was supposed to take away the lovers after their elopement so many years ago, now forever destined to roam the grounds of the rectory. Another story from the Bull's tenure at the rectory came from the year 1900. On the 27th of July, it was said that 2 of Harry's sisters, Ethel and Freda, had returned home from a garden party when they saw a woman's figure gliding out of the trees. The girls would describe her as a female figure with a bowed head, dressed entirely in black, wearing the garb of a nun. After watching it closely, they noticed the woman gliding rather than walking and instantly became terrified. The 2 frightened girls ran to call for their sister Elsie, and it was Elsie who would be brave enough to approach the nun. However, when she got close, the nun turned to face her for a few moments before disappearing before their very eyes. At one point, the sightings of the nun were so frequent, especially in the dining room. The nun would appear and stare into the dining room window, eventually causing the window to be boarded and bricked up. In 1927, a traveling handyman named Fred Cartwright also stated to have seen the nun. He witnessed her presence 4 times in the span of 2 weeks. He believed she truly was a real woman until the 4th and last time, when just like Elsie, the spirit also disappeared right in front of him. It would be in that same year that Harry Bull would pass away on the 9th of June. The remainder of the Bull family would finally leave the rectory following his death. The home itself would remain empty for over a year before it would host its next inhabitants. On the 2nd of October, 1928, Reverend Guy Eric Smith and his wife Mabel would move into the home. The spirits in the home would not wait long before beginning to torment the Smith family. Shortly after moving in, Mrs. Smith was cleaning out one of the cupboards and came across a small brown paper bag. On examining its contents, she discovered the skull of a young woman. Her husband immediately took the skull and buried it in the churchyard. One day, while he was home alone, Guy heard a voice crying, "Don't, Carlos, don't," coming from the notoriously haunted Blue Room. Phantom footsteps were heard throughout the home so often that Guy stalked them with a hockey stick. When he went to attack, there would never be anything but air. Servant bells would ring out throughout the home, even though they were all disconnected, much like it was during the Bull's tenure. Lights would appear and disappear in the windows when outside the property. Even Mrs. Smith would claim to have bared witness to the phantom carriage that roamed the property at night. It was finally in June of 1929, less than a year after the Smiths came to live at the Borley Rectory, when Reverend Smith would contact the newspaper, the Daily Mirror, with a request to be put in touch with the Society of Psychical Research. On the 10th of June, a reporter was sent to the residence who wrote the first article about the home and its happenings. It was after this article, on the 11th of June, that famed paranormal researcher Harry Price would depart for the Borley Rectory. On the 11th of June, Harry Price would write the following, explaining the situation for his departure to Borley. The news editor of a national newspaper telephoned me, saying that Reverend Guy Smith had appealed to him for help. The most extraordinary things were happening at his rectory. Bells were ringing of their own volition. Strange lights were seen in empty and locked rooms. The nun had been seen again. Slow, dragging footsteps were heard across the floor of an unoccupied room. A young midservant, imported from London, had left after 2 days' work, and her successor declared that she saw an old-fashioned coach, drawn by 2 brown horses, gallop through the hedge, sweep across the lawn, and vanish into thin air. She, too, saw the nun leaning over a gate near the house. On the 12th of June, Harry Price would arrive at Borley. The rectory, a large, ugly, red brick building with stables and an adjacent farm, faced the village church. The hill it was on overlooked Melford and Sudbury, both just 2 miles away. The village, scattered around, lay on the borders of Essex and Suffolk. The Reverend and his wife explained the events to Harry, adding in a great many numerous details. That evening, in the presence of Price, a series of poltergeist phenomena would appear before him, causing him to remark that he had never seen such phenomena as he had that day. Over 16 hours of thrills. The following day, Price's investigations continued with some of the townspeople who worked on the property. Shortly following that, Price would conclude his visit and return home. Mrs. Smith was skeptical of Harry Price's investigation, for she knew that he was an expert conjurer, owing to his talents as a musician, and blamed him for falsifying some of the phenomena they experienced during his time there. It was shortly after Price departed that the Smiths would depart from the rectory themselves, leaving on the 14th of July, 1929. In the time since Price's departure, the Smiths continued to send him updates of what had transpired in his absence until they moved out themselves. With the legend of the wickedness haunting the rectory making rounds within the community, it would be over a year before the rectory would again come to be inhabited. On the 16th of October, 1930, Reverend Lionel Algernon Foister and his wife Marianne and their 3-year-old adopted daughter Adelaide would move into the rectory. The phenomena would begin almost immediately. Over the next 5 years, Foister would keep an account of the happenings in the home in a diary he wrote that he would eventually send to Harry Price. The phenomena would reach a fever pitch in June of 1931. Some of the phenomena would usually be explained by a poltergeist, ringing of the still disconnected servant bells, throwing of stones, and writing on the walls, just to name some. During one event, their daughter Adelaide was locked in a room with no key. She was also attacked by unseen forces on a few occasions. The majority of the happenings, however, were directed at Marianne. One day, Marianne took off her watch to wash her hands. Turning back to retrieve it, she found that the strap had disappeared, though the watch still remained. Objects were frequently thrown at or past the couple, and Marianne was once struck so badly by an invisible force as to be left with a cut and a black eye. She was thrown out of bed several times, and mysterious writings, apparently connected with her, now began to appear on the walls of the house. On several occasions as well, Marianne would witness the ghost of Henry Bull Sr. appear in the rectory. It was confirmed who it was by descriptions that Marianne had given to members of the town. In October of 1931, Harry Price would return to the rectory to great fanfare from the spirits he had experienced before. Voices, apparitions, footsteps, and funny odors, as well as disappearing objects, just to name a few. Messages continued to be scratched into the walls, directed at Marianne, asking for prayers and worship. On the 14th of December, Lionel, Marianne, and Richard all witnessed a glass tumbler fall from thin air and come to rest at his feet. In January, a visitor to the rectory known as Mr. Lestrange noticed a shadowy figure standing on the porch after parking his car that disappeared before his very eyes. He also noticed a set of footsteps go past him while watching TV one day, and they disappeared into the wall behind him. The phenomena got so bad that 2 exorcisms were carried out by Reverend Foister. During the first, he was struck in the shoulder by a stone. After the second exorcism, in January of 1932, the phenomena virtually ceased. Due to the story's publicity in the Daily Mirror, it attracted the attention of various psychic researchers. After their investigations, many were convinced that some of the phenomena was caused by Marianne. Marianne would admit to a few things, namely that the phenomena was caused by her husband and one of the psychic researchers. She also claimed to have been having an affair with Frank Peerless, one of the lodgers at the rectory, and had used the paranormal explanations to cover it up. The Reverend, Marianne, and their daughter would depart the home in October of 1935. At their wits' end, and having had enough of the rectory by now, the church granted permission for the next rector of Borley to live elsewhere, and then they put the building up for sale. Before the rectory could be sold, Harry Price rented the property for 12 months in May of 1935. Price brought 48 unpaid investigators to the property. However, it was not as active with phenomena as the house had been previously. After spending time weeding out the thrill seekers and opportunists, some of the investigators that Price found were men of respectable professions: doctors, engineers, and even military men. It's a belief in the paranormal community that Harry Price led Borley Rectory to becoming a prominent paranormal location and one of the most well documented. It was during this period that a recurring question was potentially solved. Miss S.H. Glanville, the daughter of Price's lead investigator, was able to obtain information about the spirit of the nun that stalked the property through the aid of a planchette. Her name was Marie Lair, and she had come to Borley at 19 years old from a convent at Le Havre. She was murdered and buried in the vicinity of the rectory by the Waldegrave family, the local landowners, on the 17th of May, 1667. Price warned readers of his book not to take the information too seriously. After Price's lease ran out, the rectory was purchased in the autumn of 1938 by a man named Captain William Hart Gregson. He had bought the property from Queen Anne's Bounty for £500 and insured it for $10,000. At midnight on the 27th of February 1939, the rectory broke out in a blaze. Those who arrived to help or look on during the blaze took note of apparitions on the property. Captain Gregson did inform Harry Price of the numerous paranormal occurrences during his short time living at the rectory. From this point on, the rectory was a shell of its former self, but the hauntings continued. Over the next few years, the earlier monk and nun elopement legend was discredited. A person by the name Canon Pythian Adams read Price's Most Haunted House in England and advanced a theory based on his interpretation of one of the cryptic wall writings, that the bones of the murdered nun might be found under the ruins of the rectory. In 1943, Price dug up the floor in one of the cellars. Portions of the skull of a young woman were discovered. 2 years later, these remains were buried in a nearby churchyard, and masses said for the repose of Marie Lair. The ruins of the rectory continued to be investigated by groups of investigators. Phenomena continued to be reported. Until his death, Harry Price has never accepted any of the theories that the bones of the young woman discovered in the rectory belonged to Marie Lair. During various investigations, the sound of the coach could be heard through the grounds. Investigator Charles Brown and his friends witnessed an apparition in the window to the Blue Room, floating on air. Throughout the Second World War, Army officers who tried to use the cottage were turned away quickly. They would have many stories of stones thrown at them, and where it was such a negative experience, they quickly abandoned the property. It was said that on the hottest days, the officers could hear the sound of children playing in the orchard, to which there were no children near that location. The Borley Rectory would be demolished in 1944 altogether. Harry Price would pass away in 1948, leaving behind one of the most well-written ghost stories of all time. Although he, nor the events surrounding Borley Rectory for that matter, were ever without their skeptics, Price took issue with many of the comments that would arise, claiming the phenomena was of a non-paranormal nature. One of the issues was that there was a lack of liaison between the various groups of researchers, so each account would be counted as individual and not lack the power it would have collectively. Another chief critic, Major Douglas Horne, believed that Price had taken the Foister diary that he was sent and accused Price of embellishing and tweaking the facts for his own gain. In May of 1949, Mrs. Smith, one of the earlier tenants of the home, would again come forward and express her disbelief in the events at Borley. So much so that the Society for Psychical Research would conduct another investigation. They would outline their position as initially doubting Price's accounts in his book, due to the majority of his findings being incomplete, especially with some of the events surrounding his visit to the rectory. Some of the phenomena he witnessed, especially that directed at him, were events that took place only when he arrived. It wouldn't be until after his passing that his literary executor, Mr. Tabori, would turn over Price's unpublished findings to the society, that they would genuinely be able to challenge Price's observations. Mrs. Lucy Meeker, who served Harry Price as his secretary in 1929, held firm that the events at the Borley Rectory were genuine. She would counter some of the admissions of Mrs. Smith by stating that when she originally offered the information about the goings-on at Borley Rectory, she was not under any pressure, and that she would admit that something truly paranormal was happening, and that it wasn't until later on, after receiving much pressure and scrutiny, that she would eventually recant the experiences as a hoax. 3 of the investigators that worked on the case for years were quite skeptical of Harry Price's accounts. In the reports of Mrs. Goldney, Mrs. Smith informed them that she was entirely uncertain that there were paranormal events taking place at the rectory, that it was only once Harry Price arrived that things actually started happening, most of which had never happened before his arrival. In an earlier letter from Price, Mrs. Smith maintained her belief in a paranormal hypothesis that the rectory was undoubtedly haunted. Later, it was suggested that the Smiths were more a victim of suggestion by Price. When asked to provide a recounting of the events, the Smiths requested to be left out of his book, stating they did not believe in such things as ghosts. The Smiths' maid, however, had admitted that some of the happenings were perpetrated by her, even admitting to having noticed some of the happenings being manufactured by Price himself. Even though she admitted to having manufactured some of these events, she maintained her firm belief that the rectory was haunted. The third investigator in question, Mr. Hall, provides a very interesting perspective on some of the events at Borley, and how closely and similarly they could be tied to another famed paranormal haunting. The wall writings at Borley were almost unique in records of haunted houses, but not quite. The other, an earlier case, was at Amherst, Nova Scotia, only a few miles from Sackville, where the Foysters had lived before coming to Borley. There were many similarities between the experiences of Esther Cox and Mary Ann Foyster, but the incidence of wall writings in both cases leads to the suspicion that the Great Amherst Mystery may have been used as a pattern. Knowledge of the previous case is implied by Mr. Foyster's use of the most unusual pseudonym Teed in his manuscript about Borley, for Mr. Teed was the owner of the haunted house at Amherst. Mr. Hall goes on to state that he believes most of the occurrences during the Foysters' time at Borley Rectory could have been perpetrated by Mary Ann, as there was little doubt in his account. Mrs. Wildgoose, a woman in the employ of the Foysters, would admit to Mrs. Foyster's displeasure and hatred for Borley. Later, when she became known as Mrs. Fisher, the belief that Mr. Foyster was actually her father arose. Mr. Hall maintained that their credibility as a witness to these events should be called into question. Not all of those people who investigated at Borley would believe it, and the works of Harry Price to be a hoax. One of the investigators, named Alec Howe, found it hard to believe that Price was setting the stage for a colossal hoax, as they once spent an hour together in the Blue Room before dawn. Mr. Howe believed that it would not simply have been for show that Price would have done some of the happenings. One of the local townspeople, a Mrs. Henning, who was a widow of the rector to Liston cum Borley from 1939 to 1945, maintains that her and her husband, until his death, held true that the haunting of the Borley Rectory was genuine. She would state that the property was haunted before the arrival of Harry Price and certainly continued after the departure of the Foysters and the Smiths. Whether or not any person studying the case believe Borley Rectory to be haunted is their own opinion to hold. There is certainly no shortage in the amount of evidence one way or another. Whether a person wants to believe the events to have been a hoax or draw conclusions based on similarities to a previous historical haunting, they can certainly make that assumption. If one wants to believe that the haunting of the Borley Rectory was true in its entirety, they can certainly also hold that opinion. One thing is for certain. In 1976, the grounds of Borley Rectory were visited by famed paranormal researchers Ed and Lorraine Warren. During their investigation, the Warrens would encounter the spirit of the nun that was buried in the walls of the convent centuries before their arrival. When they entered the Borley Church around midnight in the darkness, they were able to capture the spirit on an infrared camera. The Warrens maintained that the nun could possibly have been the Borley nun, but couldn't confirm. Either way, their investigation at Borley became such a special location to them that they would return to the site of the former rectory and its church on their wedding anniversary for the next 21 years. At first glance, the haunting of the Borley Rectory may seem too good to be true. Many eyewitness accounts claim to have not witnessed much, if any, paranormal phenomena that would convince them the home was truly haunted, while others have come forward claiming they perpetrated the events that had come to be determined as paranormal. Others are extremely convinced that the haunting truly made the Borley Rectory the most haunted home in England, and could take the account of Harry Price as an accurate recounting of the events at the home over the years. A few questions do arise when examining all of the facts. Was the Borley Rectory truly haunted? It can be very possibly believed that it was. Was Harry Price made to look like a fraud to explain away years of paranormal events taking place there? Possibly, but with the numerous people at the property having experienced the paranormal happenings decades before Price entered, certainly cannot discredit the haunting. Could the witnesses, like Mrs. Smith, admitting that they manufactured some of the paranormal events themselves, disprove the haunting? The Borley Rectory played home to many different people and families over the years. The possibility remains that some things could have been done by each family, and that Price could have possibly embellished some of the things in his book. With the media attention the building was given, could have led to the rise in people believing something was more than meets the eye. Could it also have been a carbon copy of the same haunting that plagued Esther Cox in Amherst, Nova Scotia, simply replicated in England? It's entirely possible, as the entire haunting bears such a similar resemblance to that. One fact about the haunting remains unexplained: that no matter the accusations or admissions of guilt, each family that lived at the Borley Rectory was haunted by something. Could it have been something truly sinister that targeted some of the inhabitants that lived at the residence? Or is it truly the ghost of a nun doomed to roam the grounds for eternity in search of her lost love? With the Borley Rectory long gone, we'll never know for sure. But with the site having become such an important place to Ed and Lorraine Warren, one fact can truly be for certain: that the Borley Rectory was the most haunted home in England. If you're hearing this message, that means you've made it to the end of our episode. I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the story of the most haunted home in England, the Borley Rectory. Please take a moment to visit our Linktree and leave a review or rating of this episode, and to follow our social media pages. Please be a friend and tell a friend about the Insidious Agenda podcast. If you would like to show your support, donations can be made to our PayPal account in the link tree. New episodes are released every Tuesday morning at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And come back next week for our first hybrid true crime episode about the 1912 events that have come to be known as the Villisca Axe murders. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. I'll see you again next week.